At Thanksgiving dinner, my mother-in-law pulled out the chair beside my husband and smiled as she said, "Vanessa, sweetheart, this seat has always suited you best." I still remember the way the room went quiet after that. Not fully silent, just quiet enough for me to hear the soft scrape of that chair against the hardwood floor and the way my own pulse suddenly sounded louder than the clink of silverware. Margaret Carter had always loved polished cruelty, the kind that arrived wrapped in pearls and good manners. And at 83, she had perfected it into an art form. Her dining room looked exactly the way a Thanksgiving postcard should look, all warm candlelight and polished china, with a golden turkey at the center of the table and bowls of mashed potatoes, green beans, cranberry sauce, and sweet potato casserole arranged like a magazine spread. The smell of rosemary, butter, and cinnamon filled the air. Anyone passing by the front windows would have thought this was a family blessed beyond measure. But I knew better the second I saw Vanessa Hale, standing in Margaret's foyer in a navy wool dress, holding a bottle of red wine, and wearing the kind of smile that only appears when someone already knows they've been invited to play a role. I had spent the entire morning making my pecan pie from scratch, rolling out the crust the way Daniel always liked it, careful and even, with just enough brown sugar to make the kitchen smell like every Thanksgiving we'd shared in our 36 years of marriage. I had told myself this year would be different. Daniel had promised me it would be. On the drive over, he squeezed my hand across the center console of our SUV and said, "Mom's in a good mood today, Evie. Let's just get through dinner." That should have warned me. In the Carter family, a good mood usually meant Margaret had found a new way to test how much humiliation someone would tolerate before they broke. I stood there with my casserole dish still warm in my hands while Margaret air-kissed Vanessa's cheek and then looked at me as if I were the one arriving late to my own life. "Oh, Evelyn," she said, her lipstick-red smile never slipping. "I do hope you don't mind." Vanessa was in town visiting her sister, and I thought, why not include an old family friend on a day about gratitude? Family friend. That was the phrase she used when she wanted to make cruelty sound wholesome. Daniel went still beside me. I felt it before I saw it, the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened just enough to tell me he was uncomfortable, but not nearly enough to stop any of it. That was always Daniel's weakness. He hated conflict so much he'd let someone set a match to the curtains as long as nobody raised their voice. Vanessa laughed softly, like this was all slightly awkward but harmless, and said, "I hope I'm not intruding." Intruding. She was standing in my mother-in-law's foyer holding a bottle of Pinot Noir and wearing the exact shade of blue Margaret once told me Daniel had always loved on women. I could have said 100 things in that moment. I could have turned around. I could have set the casserole down and let it shatter on the marble floor. Instead, I smiled, because women like Margaret count on you to look emotional when they're busy looking innocent. And I had finally learned something after all these years at her table. The moment they expect you to make a scene is the exact moment you become dangerous if you don't. My casserole dish was still warm against my palms when I carried it into Margaret's kitchen, and for one absurd second I focused on that instead of the woman she had just seated beside my husband. The ceramic handles pressed into my skin, the smell of browned onions and sage rose up around me, and I told myself to breathe before I let anyone at that table see what I was thinking. Margaret's kitchen was the kind people complimented in magazines, all white cabinets, brass fixtures, and a marble island big enough to host a cooking show. But I had spent enough holidays in that house to know it was only beautiful if you did not understand what happened in it. I set my sweet potato casserole beside the turkey platter and adjusted the pecan topping with the back of a serving spoon, as if the shape of toasted pecans mattered more than the fact that my mother-in-law had invited my husband's former sweetheart to Thanksgiving dinner without a word to me. From the dining room, I could hear the soft murmur of voices, then Vanessa's laugh, low and polished, followed by Margaret's delighted little hum of approval. I had heard that sound before. Margaret made it when she believed she had arranged the room exactly the way she wanted it. Years ago, when Daniel and I were newly married, she made the same sound when she swapped out the flowers I chose for our anniversary dinner because they were too casual for the Carter home. She made it when she told me, in front of 6 relatives and a church friend, that Daniel used to prefer his roast medium rare before I changed all his habits. She made it at Christmas the year she hung an old framed photograph of Daniel at 24 with Vanessa in a red coat, standing under mistletoe, right on the piano where family pictures were supposed to go. I remember asking if she meant to leave it out, and Margaret had simply blinked at me over the rim of her wine glass and said, "Oh, Evelyn, must everything be a competition?" That was her gift. She never threw a punch. She set the room so that if you reacted, you looked unstable, jealous, difficult, or rude. She weaponized manners the way some people weaponize silence. I picked up the gravy boat and carried it to the table, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood. Daniel looked up when I approached, and for a brief moment I saw something close to apology in his eyes, but it vanished almost as quickly as it came. Vanessa was already leaning slightly toward him, smiling as Margaret carved the turkey and told a story about the old days, when the house was full of football games and loud music and young people she actually enjoyed hosting. Lauren sat 3 seats down, turning her water glass slowly in her hand, and when our eyes met she gave me the smallest shake of her head, the kind that said this was not spontaneous, not harmless, not misunderstood. I took my seat across from Daniel instead of beside him, because Margaret had made sure that place was gone, and I folded my napkin across my lap with hands so steady it almost amused me. The silverware gleamed under the chandelier. The candles flickered. The turkey was sliced. The trap had been laid with all the elegance money could buy. And the longer I sat there listening to Margaret perform generosity and Vanessa perform innocence, the more certain I became that this was not the beginning of the evening. It was the beginning of the end. Margaret served the turkey as if she were presiding over something sacred, smiling down the length of the table with that practiced expression of generosity she wore whenever she was about to be cruel in a way no one could accuse her of. The platter moved from hand to hand. The bowls of mashed potatoes and green beans followed, and for a few strained minutes everyone played their parts. Lauren complimented the cranberry sauce. Her husband, Nathan, asked Daniel about a client in Chicago. My nephew Brian reached for another roll and nearly knocked over his iced tea. To anyone who did not know better, it might have looked like a family settling into an ordinary holiday meal. But every time I lifted my fork, I could feel the arrangement of that table pressing against me like a hand between my shoulder blades. Vanessa sat close enough to Daniel that their sleeves brushed whenever either of them reached for something, and Margaret had chosen that seat with the precision of a surgeon. It was not simply beside him. It was the seat I had occupied every Thanksgiving for nearly 3 decades, the place where Daniel would nudge my knee under the table and ask me to pass the gravy, the place where we used to exchange the small private smiles that married people develop over time. Margaret had not just invited an old girlfriend. She had erased me in front of everyone and expected me to stay polite while she did it. "Vanessa still makes the most wonderful cornbread dressing," Margaret said brightly, dabbing the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin. Daniel used to ask for seconds every time she brought it to church potlucks. There it was, not even subtle. A polished little arrow wrapped in nostalgia. Vanessa laughed, lowering her eyes just enough to appear modest. "That was a long time ago, Margaret. I am sure Daniel has moved on to more sophisticated tastes." She said it lightly, but I heard the invitation in it. Daniel shifted in his chair and cleared his throat. "Evelyn's pecan pie is still the best thing on any Thanksgiving table," he said, and though the words were technically kind, they landed with all the force of a damp paper towel. A compliment offered too late and too softly, like he was tossing me a life vest after the boat had already sunk. Margaret gave him a fond smile that held no warmth at all. "Of course, dear. Evelyn has always been very dependable. Dependable. Not beloved. Not cherished. Not elegant. Not brilliant. Dependable. As if I were a reliable appliance she had tolerated in the family because I arrived on time and brought dessert." Lauren's fork stopped halfway to her plate. I noticed because I notice everything when I am being tested. Nathan looked down at his food. Brian suddenly found the butter dish fascinating. No one challenged Margaret because everyone at that table had been trained, in one way or another, to let her define the weather in the room. I took a sip of water and set my glass down carefully. My pulse had slowed. That surprised me. I had expected anger, humiliation, maybe even that sharp sting behind the eyes that comes when you realize someone has gone out of their way to make you small. Instead, what I felt was clarity, clean and cold. Because the moment Margaret mentioned church potlucks from 40 years ago, I understood something I should have understood much sooner. This was not about Vanessa. It was not even about Daniel. It was about ownership. Margaret was reminding everyone at that table that in her mind, every seat, every tradition, every memory, and every person in that family still belonged to her. And women like Margaret always made the same mistake. They believed the person who stayed quiet was the person with the least power. Lauren waited until Margaret stood up to refresh the gravy boat before she moved. And even then she did it with the careful timing of someone who had grown up around landmines. She rose from her chair, picked up the empty cranberry bowl, and looked directly at me. "Aunt Evelyn, can you help me in the kitchen for a second?" Her voice was light, almost casual, but there was something in her eyes that had not been there 10 minutes earlier. It was the same look I had seen on her face when she was 16 and caught her boyfriend lying about where he had been on prom night. Not confusion, certainty. I folded my napkin beside my plate and stood without a word. Margaret barely glanced up as we walked away, too busy telling Vanessa how lovely it was to see familiar faces back where they belong. That line floated after me all the way into the kitchen, where the sounds of silverware and polite conversation softened under the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking brass clock above the pantry door. Lauren set the cranberry bowl in the sink, turned on the faucet for exactly 2 seconds to create noise, then shut it off and faced me. "She invited her last week," she said quietly. "Not yesterday. Not this morning. Last week." I did not blink. I did not ask who she meant. There was no need. "How do you know?" I asked, and even to my own ears my voice sounded calmer than it should have. Lauren glanced toward the doorway, then pulled her phone from the pocket of her cardigan. "Because Grandma sent me a text by mistake. She meant to send it to Vanessa." She unlocked the screen with trembling fingers and held it out to me. I read the message once, then again, not because I had misunderstood it, but because I wanted to make sure I would remember every word exactly as it was written. "Wear the blue dress. Daniel always loved you in blue. I put you beside him. Let us see if some people still know how to make an impression." For a moment the kitchen became strangely still. I could hear the refrigerator motor kick on. I could smell sage and butter and dish soap. Somewhere in the dining room, Brian laughed too loudly at something Nathan said, the kind of laugh people use when they are trying to drown out tension. But inside that kitchen, everything narrowed to the glow of Lauren's phone in my hand and the clean, ugly proof of what Margaret had done. It was one thing to suspect cruelty. It was another to see it typed out in perfect punctuation. "I am so sorry," Lauren whispered. I did not know until we sat down and I checked my messages. I thought maybe I was reading it wrong, but then when she made that comment about the dressing and the church potlucks, she let the sentence die on its own. She did not need to finish it. I handed the phone back to her carefully, as if it were made of something fragile and sharp. "Did anyone else see this?" I asked. She shook her head. "No. I wanted to tell you before dessert. Before she got worse. Before she got worse." That was what struck me. Lauren, at 34, still believed Margaret had levels. I looked past her toward the doorway, where the warm yellow light from the dining room spilled across the kitchen floor in a long polished strip. I could picture the table exactly as I had left it. Daniel sitting stiff and uncomfortable. Vanessa smiling too softly. Margaret glowing under the chandelier like a queen who thought she had already won. My humiliation had been planned down to the color of another woman's dress. And strangely, that was the moment I stopped feeling embarrassed. Embarrassment belongs to uncertainty. It belongs to moments when you wonder if you are overreacting, if you misunderstood, if perhaps you are being too sensitive. But there is a kind of peace that comes with evidence. It is not warm. It is not comforting. It is cold and clean and almost merciful. I adjusted the cuff of my blouse, smoothed a hand over my skirt, and met Lauren's worried gaze. "Thank you," I said. "Now let us go back in there before your grandmother mistakes my silence for surrender." I walked back into the dining room carrying nothing but my own composure, and somehow that felt heavier than the casserole dish I had brought in earlier. The table looked exactly the same as when I had left it, but I was not the same woman who had stepped into the kitchen. Margaret was at the head of the table, one hand curved around her wine glass, smiling in that soft, satisfied way she always did when she believed she had arranged everyone exactly where she wanted them. Vanessa sat with her shoulders angled toward Daniel, one manicured hand resting lightly near his sleeve, her blue dress catching the chandelier light just enough to make the color impossible to ignore. Daniel looked up the moment I returned, and I saw the question in his face before he even opened his mouth. He knew something had changed. He just did not know whether it would cost him. I slid into my chair across from him, folded my hands in my lap, and reached for my water glass as calmly as if I had only stepped away to check the oven. Margaret noticed the shift too. Women like her always do. She narrowed her eyes for half a second, then smiled wider. "There you are, Evelyn," she said. "We were just reminiscing. Vanessa was telling us about that lake trip from years ago. Daniel caught the biggest bass any of us had ever seen. 12 pounds, was it, dear?" Daniel's fork stopped halfway to his plate. Vanessa laughed delicately, like she had every right to be inside a memory that predated my marriage, but somehow still belonged at my Thanksgiving table. "I think it was closer to 10, she said. "But your mother always loved making it sound more impressive." Margaret touched her pearls and chuckled. "Well, some things deserve a little embellishment." I watched them both for one long heartbeat, then I smiled. Not because I found any of it amusing, but because there is a particular kind of smile that unsettles manipulative people more than anger ever could. It is the smile of someone who has stopped asking for permission to understand what is happening. "That is funny," I said, setting my glass down with a soft click. I was just thinking the same thing. Some people do love embellishment. The table went still. Not dramatically, just enough. Nathan looked down. Brian reached for the salt and then changed his mind. Lauren kept her gaze on her plate, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. Margaret's expression did not crack, though I noticed the way her fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass. "Oh," she said lightly. "And what exactly were you embellishing in the kitchen?" There it was. The challenge wrapped in a joke. The old invitation to defend myself and look unstable in the process. I picked up my fork and cut into the turkey, because nothing frustrates a woman like Margaret more than being ignored on schedule. "Nothing at all," I said. "Lauren simply helped me remember something useful. Timing matters more than people think." Daniel looked from me to Lauren and back again. His face had gone pale enough that even Brian noticed. Vanessa shifted in her chair for the first time that evening, the confidence in her posture thinning around the edges. She had come expecting a performance, but she did not know the script anymore. Margaret, on the other hand, leaned back in her chair and gave me a long considering look, the kind a chess player gives when she realizes the other person has finally seen the board. "Well," she said after a beat too long. "Thank goodness we are all family here." I set down my fork and met her eyes across the candlelight. "That depends," I said softly. "Some invitations tell the truth better than people do." No one moved. Even the candles seemed to burn more quietly. And for the first time all evening, Margaret Carter looked at me not like a dependable woman she could rearrange, but like someone she should have measured more carefully. Dessert should have been the safest part of the evening. In most families, pie and coffee mean the worst is over, that whatever awkwardness happened during dinner can be softened with sugar and small talk. But in Margaret's house, dessert was often when she sharpened the knife. She believed people were weakest after they had relaxed, and she mistook quiet for comfort the way other people mistake politeness for love. I stood when the plates were nearly cleared and said, "Before we cut the pie, I would love to make a toast." The room shifted immediately. Even Brian straightened in his chair. Margaret's smile returned, brighter now, relieved perhaps that I was finally stepping into the role she had written for me. She expected gratitude, maybe something gracious and slightly strained that would let everyone pretend the evening had not been engineered like a social experiment. Vanessa folded her hands in her lap and lowered her chin with that practiced expression women use when they want to look innocent in expensive lighting. Daniel stared at me so hard I could feel it, his fork still in his hand, his face caught somewhere between dread and hope. I picked up my water glass instead of wine. That detail mattered to me for reasons I could not fully explain. Wine can be blamed on emotion. Water sounds like intention. "I want to thank Margaret," I said, and her eyes lit with satisfaction so quickly it almost made me pity her. No one stages a holiday quite like she does. The candles, the china, the perfect stories, the carefully chosen guests. She has always believed Thanksgiving is about remembering what matters. A few uncertain smiles appeared around the table. Nathan glanced at Lauren. Brian looked like he wanted to disappear into the upholstered back of his chair. Margaret inclined her head modestly, though the pride in her face was impossible to miss. "That is very kind, Evelyn," she said. "Family traditions should be honored." I looked directly at her and smiled. "Exactly." Then I set my glass down and reached into my handbag, which had been resting beside my chair all evening. The sound of the clasp opening seemed louder than it should have. I pulled out my phone, unlocked it, and turned the screen toward the center of the table. "That is why I find this so touching," I said softly. "Especially the part where you texted Lauren by mistake and told Vanessa to wear blue because Daniel always loved her in blue, and that you put her beside him to see if some people still knew how to make an impression." Nobody moved. Nobody even pretended to. The silence that followed was not the soft, strange silence of dinner. It was the kind that settles over a room when everyone realizes the performance has ended and the real script has just been placed on the table. Margaret's color changed first, not dramatically, but enough that the pink in her cheeks drained into something chalkier beneath her foundation. Vanessa's hand slid away from Daniel's sleeve as if the fabric had suddenly become hot. Daniel stood so abruptly his chair legs scraped the floor. "What?" he said, and it came out hoarse, not angry yet, but close enough that the word landed like a dropped plate. Margaret recovered first, because of course she did. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she said, letting out a brittle little laugh. "You cannot possibly be making a federal case out of a harmless joke between women." Harmless. There was that word again, the favorite shield of people who have never paid the price for their own cruelty. I did not raise my voice. I did not look at Vanessa. I kept my eyes on Margaret, because this had never truly been about the woman in blue. "No," I said, "I am making a very small and very accurate case out of a very deliberate choice." Daniel turned toward his mother slowly, and in that moment I watched a man who had spent most of his life confusing avoidance with peace finally understand the cost of both. "You invited her to humiliate Evelyn?" he asked. Margaret opened her mouth, but for once, the room was no longer hers to arrange. Margaret looked at Daniel the way she always did when she wanted to drag him back into childhood, with wounded dignity and just enough disbelief to make him feel guilty for noticing what she had done. "Do not be ridiculous," she said, her voice crisp and offended now, the sweetness finally stripped away. "I invited an old family friend to Thanksgiving. If your wife is insecure enough to turn that into some kind of scandal, that says more about her than it does about me." There it was, clean and familiar. If she could not deny the action, she would attack the reaction. She had used that strategy for decades, and for a long time it worked because Daniel would always rush in to smooth things over, to lower the temperature, to ask everyone to calm down as if calmness and fairness were the same thing. But something had shifted in him. Maybe it was the text message glowing on my phone screen. Maybe it was the way the entire table had gone still. Or maybe it was simply the fact that at 64 years old, he had finally run out of excuses for the woman who raised him. He turned to Vanessa next. "Did you know?" he asked, and his voice was low enough to be dangerous without being loud. Vanessa's face changed in stages. First surprise, then offense, then the quick calculation of someone deciding how much honesty would cost. "Margaret invited me," she said carefully. "She said you and Evelyn had been having a difficult year and thought it might be nice to reconnect with people who knew you before things got so complicated." I almost admired the wording. Not quite a lie, not quite the truth. Just enough poison dissolved in enough politeness to make it seem drinkable. Daniel stared at her as if he had never seen her clearly before. "Reconnect," he repeated. "At Thanksgiving? At my mother's house? In the seat where my wife has sat every year for almost 30 years. Vanessa opened her mouth, then closed it again. Across the table, Lauren lowered her gaze, but I could see relief flicker across her face. Nathan exhaled through his nose, slow and silent. Brian looked at Margaret with the stunned expression of someone realizing the family myth had finally cracked in public. Margaret, however, was not finished. Women like her rarely surrender when they can still escalate. She set down her napkin with deliberate care and looked at me, not Daniel. "I suppose this is what we are doing now," she said. "Turning a holiday into a courtroom because Evelyn cannot tolerate being reminded that Daniel had a life before her." Her voice was steady, but I caught the strain underneath it, the first tiny fracture in the polished shell. "No," I said, and my own voice surprised even me. It sounded almost gentle. "We are turning a holiday into the truth, because you assumed I would protect your image the way I always have." That landed harder than anger would have. Margaret blinked. Just once. Daniel turned toward me then, and I watched shame move across his face like a shadow crossing water. "Evie," he said quietly, I should have stopped this the second we walked in. It was the first fully honest sentence he had spoken all evening. Not an excuse. Not a soft distraction. Not a delayed compliment offered like a bandage over an old wound. An admission. And because truth has a way of rearranging everything once it finally enters a room, the entire table seemed to tilt with it. Margaret sat back as if she had been physically offended by the idea that Daniel might choose clarity over comfort. Vanessa reached for her purse. Nathan looked like he wanted to applaud and feared for his life if he did. I set my hands flat on the tablecloth, feeling the embroidered fabric beneath my fingertips, and understood with startling certainty that I no longer needed anyone there to validate what had happened. I had the evidence. I had the witnesses. More importantly, I had myself. "Sit down, Daniel," I said softly. "This is not over. But for the first time tonight, it is finally honest." Daniel sat down slowly, but he did not look at his plate. He looked at his mother the way a man looks at a door he has walked through his whole life only to realize, far too late, that it had always been locked from the outside. Margaret, however, was still trying to reclaim the room. She straightened her spine, smoothed the front of her silk blouse, and folded her hands on the table as if she were the injured party in a courtroom she had not agreed to attend. "This is absurd," she said, her voice clipped and cool. "One misplaced text, and suddenly I am the villain because I invited a woman I have known for 40 years to a family dinner." She emphasized the word family with such precision that even Brian flinched. If anyone has turned this into something ugly, it is Evelyn. Vanessa stood then, her chair moving back with a sharp scrape that broke the strange stillness. "I think I should go," she said, clutching her purse with both hands now. Gone was the polished confidence she had arrived with. She looked older suddenly, not because of her face, but because humiliation ages people faster than time. Margaret turned toward her, almost offended by the retreat. "Sit down, Vanessa. Do not let this melodrama chase you out." But Vanessa was no longer looking at Margaret. She was looking at me. "I did not know about the text," she said quietly. "Not until now. I knew Margaret wanted me here, and I knew it was unusual, but I did not know she was trying to make some kind of point." I held her gaze for a moment and saw what I had not allowed myself to see all evening. She was not innocent, but she was not the architect either. She had enjoyed being invited back into old memories. She had liked being admired. She had probably liked the idea that Margaret still preferred her, but she had not built the trap. Margaret had. "Then you should leave," I said, and my voice remained calm enough to make the words sharper. "Because the point has already been made." Vanessa gave one short nod. No tears. No protest. Just a woman finally understanding she had mistaken nostalgia for relevance. She picked up her coat from the back of her chair, murmured a strained goodbye to no one in particular, and walked out through the front hall. The sound of the front door closing was strangely clean. Final. Like the snapping shut of a jewelry box after something expensive has been removed. Margaret stared at the doorway for half a second, then turned back toward me with a look I had not seen on her face in all the years I had known her. Not anger. Not quite. It was something closer to disbelief. She had expected resistance. She had expected tears, maybe a dramatic exit, perhaps even a raised voice she could dismiss later over coffee with friends. What she had not expected was control. "Are you satisfied now?" she asked, and there was venom in it at last, stripped of all polish. "You have embarrassed this family over nothing." Daniel pushed his chair back again, but this time he did not rise halfway and hesitate. He stood fully and placed both hands on the table. "No, Mom," he said, and his voice was steady in a way I had almost forgotten it could be. "You embarrassed this family. You invited my former girlfriend to Thanksgiving, seated her in my wife's place, and sent a message bragging about it. You did not make a joke. You made a choice." The words seemed to hit Margaret harder than any accusation I had made, because they came from the son she had always assumed would translate her cruelty into harmlessness. Lauren covered her mouth with her hand. Nathan leaned back in his chair, staring openly now. Brian muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like, "About time." Margaret looked from Daniel to me, and for the first time in 36 years, I watched her realize she could not divide us by pretending she had only ever been misunderstood. I reached for my napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it beside my untouched slice of pecan pie. "A holiday table tells the truth," I said quietly. especially when people think you will stay seated no matter how they treat you. Then I rose, picked up my handbag, and understood that whether Daniel followed me or not, I was done eating from a table built to make me smaller. The cold air outside Margaret's house hit my face like clarity. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp leaves, and somewhere down the block a neighbor's porch light glowed over a row of pumpkins that had not yet been taken in for the season. I walked down the front steps without rushing, my heels steady against the stone, my handbag over my shoulder, my spine straighter than it had felt in years. Behind me, I heard the front door open before I reached the driveway. "Evie, wait." Daniel's voice carried across the crisp November night, stripped of all the soft evasions he had used for too long. I stopped beside our SUV, but did not turn immediately. There is a difference between pausing and yielding, and for the first time in a very long time, I knew exactly which one I was doing. When I finally looked back, he was standing on the front walk without his coat, the warm light from the foyer behind him, his face drawn and pale and finally, unmistakably honest. "I am sorry," he said, and the words landed differently this time because he did not decorate them with explanations. "Not just for tonight. For all of it. For every time I asked you to tolerate something I should have stopped." The house behind him remained lit and silent, as if even Margaret understood that following us outside would be the one performance she could not control. I held his gaze and saw the man I had married buried beneath the habits his mother had trained into him, the peacekeeping, the delay, the instinct to make discomfort disappear rather than confront what caused it. I meant what I said in there, I told him. This was never about one dinner. It was about every holiday, every little comment, every time she made me smaller, and you called it family. Daniel nodded once, hard, like the truth physically hurt. "I know." He came closer, but not too close. That mattered too. I told myself keeping the peace was the same as protecting you. It was not. It was protecting myself from having to choose. The honesty in that sentence did something no apology had managed to do all evening. It made room for silence that did not feel manipulative, just real. I looked down at the ring on my left hand, the one I had worn for 36 years through mortgages and funerals and anniversaries and ordinary Tuesdays, through flu seasons and career changes and long drives and longer arguments. I did not take it off, not because everything was fine, and not because I owed him immediate forgiveness, but because I was no longer interested in dramatic gestures that could be mistaken for decisions. "I am going home," I said, "not to punish you, not to prove a point, because I am done sitting at tables where I am expected to disappear. If you want this marriage, you can. Come home tomorrow, and we can talk. But if you want your mother's version of family, stay here tonight and save us both the trouble." Daniel did not hesitate, not for 1 second. He exhaled, almost like a man surfacing after being underwater too long, and nodded toward the passenger door. "Then let us go home." 1 week later, Thanksgiving leftovers were gone, but the truth remained. Daniel called Margaret and told her we would not be spending Christmas at her house. When she accused me of turning him against her, he said no, calmly and clearly, that she had done that herself. He asked for distance. Real distance. No drop-ins, no guilt calls, no invitations disguised as traps. Lauren sent me flowers the next day with a note that simply read, "I saw everything." Nathan agrees. Brian texted Daniel 3 words that made me laugh harder than I had in months. About damn time. And on Christmas Eve, I set my own table. My good china. My candles. My pecan pie. The house smelled like cinnamon and rosemary and the kind of peace that does not have to beg to be included. Daniel stood beside me in the kitchen carving the roast. Not because it erased what had happened, but because healing is not built from grand speeches. It is built from repeated choices made in full view. That Thanksgiving, I did not lose a seat at the table. I lost the need to keep earning one in rooms designed to humiliate me. And that, more than any apology, felt like the beginning of something worth celebrating.